3 years you've been standing outside that door," Rhett Calderon said, his voice dropping to the particular register he reserved for things that weren't questions at all. "And tonight is the first time I've actually seen you." Vesper Halsey had spent those 3 years making sure no one did. It wasn't difficult. She was good at erasure, at the quiet, disciplined work of flattening herself into the background of other people's important lives. At Calderon Capital's offices on 53rd Street, she wore dove-grey blazers 2 sizes too large for her frame, kept her dark hair pinned back in a knot so tight it gave her migraines by Thursday afternoons, and moved through the glass corridors with the soundless efficiency of very expensive office equipment. She answered Rhett Calderon's phone. She managed his schedule across 4 time zones. She kept her eyes down and her expression pleasant, and her ambitions buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. Almost. Before Calderon Capital, before the grey blazers and the severe bun, and the 3 years of careful, practiced invisibility, Vesper had been a pianist. Not a hobbyist, not someone who played at holiday parties. She had studied at Juilliard on a full scholarship, graduated at the top of her cohort, and been described by her teacher, Professor Hartwell, as the most emotionally precise player he'd taught in 4 decades. She'd had a Carnegie Hall debut scheduled, a real one, program printed, sponsor secured, a review promised from a critic who mattered. She'd walked on stage, placed her hands on the Steinway, looked out at 800 faces in the dark, and her hands had refused to move. 11 seconds. She'd counted them later, in the dark of her apartment, over and over, until the number stopped meaning anything. 11 seconds of absolute silence before she'd walked off the stage and kept walking. She hadn't walked back onto one since. The job at Calderon Capital had been a kind of hiding, a place to be competent without being visible. Rhett Calderon was, by any measure, not a man who inspired comfort. He was 38, built like someone who'd learned to fight long before he learned to negotiate, and ran a private equity empire that generated clean, documented revenue, while the other half of what he ran didn't appear in any quarterly filing. He'd inherited his father's network, not his money. A constellation of arrangements stretching from the New York waterfront to Baltimore, from longshoremen who looked the other way at the right moment to federal inspectors who'd developed convenient blind spots. The Calderon syndicate wasn't a gang. It was a system, and Rhett ran it with the same cold precision he applied to everything. In 3 years, he'd addressed Vesper directly, perhaps 40 times he called her Miss Halsey. He did not ask about her weekends. She had been to him a flawlessly running machine, and she had worked very hard to stay that way. The call came on a Thursday in November. "Cancel my afternoon," his voice said through the intercom. "Come to my office." He was at the window when she entered. He was always at the window, she'd noticed long ago, as though the city below required constant monitoring. He didn't turn around. "The Beaumont Foundation Gala is Saturday night," he said. "Lincoln Center, I need to attend." "I know, I arranged your table." "Elaine Parrish won't be joining me." He said it the way he announced supply chain adjustments. "She's been relocated to the London office." Vesper kept her face neutral. She knew what relocated meant. Elaine Parrish, the socialite who'd been Rhett's habitual public companion for the better part of a year, had likely been moved for reasons that had everything to do with the quiet, grinding war the Calderon syndicate had been conducting against the Renne family for 3 northeastern shipping corridors, and nothing whatsoever to do with London. "You need someone to attend with you," Vesper said. "I need someone who knows the guest list, understands the stakes, and won't ask questions at the wrong moment." He finally turned from the window. He looked at her. Not past her, not through her, but directly at her, which was unusual enough to be slightly disorienting. "I need you." "Me?" "Use the company card. Buy something appropriate." He turned back to the window. "Car at 7:30. The conversation was over. Bergdorf Goodman on a Thursday afternoon was its own particular theatre, and Vesper moved through the formal wear floor with the focused desperation of someone on a mission she didn't fully understand. She pulled at hems that were too short, held up necklines that plunged past any reasonable definition of appropriate, set aside silhouettes engineered for women who wanted to be consumed rather than simply present. She was standing in the center of the floor, holding a perfectly sensible navy sheath. Invisible in expensive packaging, exactly right, when the stylist appeared at her elbow. Her name was Clem. She wore reading glasses on a chain, and she had the expression of someone who had spent 20 years watching women choose the wrong dress for the wrong reasons. "That will make you look like you're testifying before a committee," Clem said. She removed the navy sheath from Vesper's hands with practiced authority. He said appropriate. "That doesn't mean absent." The dress was at the end of a far rack, slightly separated from the others, as though it knew it didn't require the company. Deep crimson, not red, not wine, something older and more specific, the color of dried roses or dark garnets. Heavy silk charmeuse, long sleeves, high neckline in the front, a silhouette that looked on the hanger entirely modest. Vesper stood in the fitting room and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. The silk clung. It had no interest whatsoever in pretending she was two-dimensional. The woman in the mirror had cheekbones she'd forgotten about, and dark hair that Clem had insisted on releasing from its knot, which fell in loose, heavy waves past her shoulders. The woman in the mirror had a body that 3 years of oversized blazers had concealed with remarkable success. She recognized the woman in the mirror the way you recognize a face from a photograph taken before something difficult happened. "I'll take it," she said. The private elevator opened into Rhett's penthouse at precisely 7:30. She could hear him before the doors finished parting. Low and rapid Italian, the particular cadence she recognized from his calls that couldn't wait for privacy. "Move the secondary manifests before the 15th. The Chesapeake transfer holds." A pause colder. "I don't care what Rennie's people are saying. Deal with it." He turned as he spoke, phone at his ear, and stopped. Not for a moment, not for a breath. He stopped entirely, the call dying somewhere in the middle of whatever he'd been about to say, and looked at Vesper the way she had never once seen him look at anything, with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental, something he'd believed settled and discovered, suddenly was not settled at all. The phone lowered. She wasn't certain he said goodbye. He set it down on a side table and crossed the room toward her, unhurried, deliberate, the way a man moves when he's completely certain the thing he's moving toward isn't going anywhere. He stopped close enough that she caught the faint scent of sandalwood and aged bourbon, and the specific, indefinable something underneath it that she'd spent 3 years being close enough to notice without having a name for. 3 years you've been standing outside that door, he said, and tonight is the first time I've actually seen you. Vesper's hands tightened slightly on her clutch. The car is waiting, Mr. Calderon. Where have you been keeping this, he said, and it wasn't a compliment, exactly. It was something more unsettled than that, something that sounded almost like an accusation. She was always here, Vesper said. You never looked. A muscle moved in his jaw. He held her gaze for a beat, longer than was comfortable. No, he said, I didn't. He stepped back, adjusted his cuffs, the gear shift she recognized the CEO resettling over the unguarded thing, and moved toward the elevator. Let's go. The David Geffen Hall was a jewelry box that night, all warm gold light and crystal, and the layered self-satisfaction of New York's elite gathered to fund culture in between deals that wouldn't survive daylight. Vesper knew the guest list because she'd built it. She recognized the third-row faces, the ones with waterfront access and federal relationships, and the kind of influence that moved through handshakes rather than paperwork. Rhett's hand found the small of her back the moment they walked in. It did not leave. She'd attended a dozen events like this in her official capacity. Tablet, earpiece, invisible in a room full of people whose names she'd memorized. This was different. In the crimson silk with her hair down and Rhett Calderon's hand making a proprietorial statement against her spine, every eye in the room found her. Men held their gaze a second past polite. Women assessed her with the rapid, thorough calculation of people who understood what it meant to be standing next to Rhett Calderon in that particular way. "You're doing it again," Rhett said, near her ear, low enough for just her. Doing what? Trying to disappear, his hand pressed slightly. "Stop." It was Calder Renne who noticed her looking at the piano. The Steinway Concert Grand sat on a low platform near the east wall, positioned for the evening's musical program, and Vesper had been aware of it since the moment they'd arrived. The awareness low and persistent, like the ache of an old injury in cold weather. She'd been keeping her eyes off it with the same deliberate effort she applied to everything she was trying not to think about. Renne was 50, silver-haired, narrow through the shoulders, with a smile that suggested he was always waiting for something to go wrong for someone nearby. She recognized him from Rhett's files. He led the Renne family's Eastern Seaboard operations, pharmaceutical distribution, dock security, a network of relationships that had taken him 2 decades to build, and that Rhett had been methodically dismantling for the past year. "Miss Halsey," Renne said, appearing at her elbow while Rhett was absorbed by the deputy comptroller. Smooth, easy, like a man who'd prepared for this encounter. "Juilliard loans their concert instruments for events like this. I believe that's the same Steinway you trained on." She turned to him with the expression she'd spent 3 years perfecting, pleasant, unreadable, not a single door left ajar. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I know who you are." His eyes moved briefly to where Rhett stood across the room. "I've known for quite some time. They say you were extraordinary." He gestured lightly toward the piano. "I wonder whether Mr. Calderon is aware of your hidden gift." She felt the shape of what he was doing, the slow arrangement of pieces into a configuration that served him. She understood it clearly. And then she did something he hadn't planned for. She set down her champagne, walked to the Steinway, and sat down. No announcement, no preamble. She simply placed her hands on the keys. She played the Ravel, the piece she'd been scheduled to open Carnegie Hall with 3 years ago, the piece she hadn't touched since the night she'd walked off stage and kept walking. It lasted 4 minutes. By the second, the room had gone quiet. By the third, there was a circle of people around the instrument, champagne forgotten in their hands, watching a woman in a crimson dress play with the particular devastating precision of someone who had been waiting a very long time to remember who they were. When she lifted her hands from the keys, the silence held for 3 full seconds before the applause began. Rhett was standing at the edge of the circle. She found his face in the crowd without looking for it. He had always taken up a specific kind of space in any room, and what she saw there was something she'd never seen before. The closed, controlled face open, something unguarded and almost tender moving across it before he could bring the armor back. She walked back to where Renne was standing. "You were right," she said. "I was extraordinary." His smile shifted slightly. "Yes," he said, "you were." And 20 minutes later, when Rhett came back to her side, Renne made his move. "You should tell him about your brother," Renne said pleasantly, "before I do." He looked at Rhett as he said it, and Vesper felt the floor drop slightly beneath her feet. "Ask her about Ridley Halsey. Ask her what arrangement he made with my family 18 months before she took the job at your firm. Ask her why she's been inside the Calderon network for 3 years with access to everything that matters, and ask her who put her there." The silence between the 3 of them was total. Rhett looked at Vesper. The open thing she'd seen during the Ravel was completely gone. In its place was the expression she'd seen in photographs of him taken by journalists who'd met him once and spent the rest of their features trying to describe what it had been like to be on the receiving end of it. Still, cold, absolute. "Is this true?" he said, barely above a whisper. It landed like a verdict. He didn't drag her anywhere. He simply walked, and she followed, because in that moment it was the only sensible option. The private lounge off the main corridor was dim and empty, smelling of leather and the residue of 1,000 event night conversations. He closed the door. He stood with his back to it and waited. She told him everything. The phone call from Ridley, nearly 3 years ago, frantic, desperate, her brother telling her he owed the Renne family a staggering sum from investments that had gone disastrously wrong. The call from one of Renne's lieutenants the following week, the offer extended with the precise calm of someone who expected it to be accepted. Get close to Calderon Capital, gather intelligence on the shipping operations, and Ridley's debt would be forgiven over time. I took the job because I didn't know what else to do, she said. I was terrified. I thought I was protecting him. The information, Rhett said. His voice was controlled in a way that was more frightening than anger. What did you give them? She held his gaze. Nothing that worked. I gave Renne redacted manifests with deliberate errors, port schedules already in the public record. I stalled, I rewrote, I manufactured delays in every report they asked for. In 3 years, I never gave the Renne family a single piece of intelligence that could have been used against you. Why? She'd known the question was coming. She'd been running from it for 2 years, turning away from it in quiet moments, refusing to look at it directly. Because somewhere in the first year of working for you, she said, I stopped being afraid of Renne, and I started being terrified of something else entirely. She looked at him, at the closed face, the controlled stillness, the man who had spent 3 years not seeing her. I fell in love with you. I don't know precisely when, and I understand if that's... He crossed the room in 4 steps and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It had nothing to do with gentleness. His hands framed her face and tilted her up, and he kissed her with the focused, deliberate intensity of a man releasing something he'd been holding in compression for a long time without knowing it. Kissed her until the room narrowed to just the 2 of them and the sound of her own heartbeat. When he pulled back, they were both unsteady. If you're lying to me, he said, his forehead against hers, his voice rough in a way she'd never heard before, I will not forgive it. I'm not lying. Then Renne is going to make a move tonight. He stepped back. She could watch the syndicate commander settling back into place over the man who had just kissed her. The armor reassembling with visible precision, he pulled out his phone. He'll use your brother as leverage. We find Ridley first. He lifted the phone. Gaines, code 2 at Lincoln Center. Locate Ridley Halsey. Full detail. Archer Gaines was waiting at the service entrance with 4 men in plain clothes, and the demeanor of someone for whom this particular phone call had been anticipated. He was former Delta Force, separated under circumstances not discussed, and he ran the Calderon Syndicate's enforcement arm with the quiet, methodical focus of a surgeon in an operating room. Halsey's been at a property in Red Hook 3 nights running, Gaines said, walking beside Rhett toward the waiting vehicles. Our surveillance on Renne's secondary assets picked him up 48 hours ago. Vesper processed this. He was being watched? Gaines glanced at her. His expression was professionally neutral. The property is a Renne asset. She went still. She thought she understood what that meant. She was wrong about how far it went. The Red Hook warehouse had been converted to something. Offices, storage, the infrastructure of ongoing operations. Gaines's team entered through the loading bay and cleared the building in under 3 minutes. Vesper was in the rear vehicle watching the live feed on a tablet, and what she saw when they breached the main room was not what she had spent 3 years believing. There was no holding cell, no evidence of coercion. Ridley Halsey was seated at a large table covered in documents and laptops, a glass of wine at his elbow, wearing a jacket she didn't recognize, looking for all the world like a man who'd been interrupted during a working dinner. When Gaines's team disarmed him and brought him forward, he didn't look frightened. He looked inconvenienced. They brought him to a Calderon property in Greenpoint that functioned as a staging facility. Vesper walked down to where he'd been seated, and her brother looked up at her with the expression of someone rapidly recalculating his position. Vesper, he said, apologetic, calibrated, prepared. Tell me it isn't what I think, she said. He held her eyes for 3 seconds. I can't do that. The story came out in the practical language of someone who'd made peace with their choices long before they had to explain them. 3 years ago, there had been no gambling debt. There had been an opportunity. Renne had identified Calderon Capital as a strategic target and needed an internal position, and Ridley had recognized an opening for himself. He'd approached Renne first. He'd offered his sister as the access point. "You've always been able to get close to powerful people," Ridley said. "You don't even know how you do it. Professors loved you. Critics loved you. I figured it would work the same way here." "You were crying," Vesper said. "On the phone, you were panicking. You were always harder to move when things seemed manageable." He said it without visible remorse. "I needed you to believe it was an emergency." Rhett was at the top of the stairs. She could feel him there without looking. "Vesper." Ridley's voice shifted, finally. The calculation receding, something more genuine and considerably less comfortable rising under it. "We're family. Whatever you're considering." "I know exactly what family means," she said. "I've been living that definition for 3 years." She turned and walked up the stairs. She stopped beside Rhett and looked at him for a moment. At the contained fury, the waiting patience, the question he hadn't asked. "Don't kill him," she said. She felt him go absolutely still. "Everything Ridley knows about the Renne organization," she continued, her voice steady and quiet. "He was inside that room. He's been in those meetings for 3 years. He knows the shell companies, the shipping routes, the ledger accounts, the names of every official Renne has compromised." She held Rhett's gaze. "Get all of it. Document everything. Then put him on the street with 48 hours and nothing he didn't earn himself. No money, no protection, no network. Let him survive on the other side of this with whatever he can build from zero." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his eyes. Assessment. And then something deeper than assessment. "Gaines," he said, without raising his voice. Gaines appeared from the corridor. "Full extraction protocol. Everything Ridley Halsey knows about the Renne operation. Accounts, personnel, logistics, compromised officials. Begin immediately." Ridley's voice came from below, sharp and panicked, calling her name. Vesper didn't look down. An hour later, in the glass-walled office on the upper floor, Rhett poured 2 glasses of bourbon and set one in front of her without asking. He stood at the window. Always the window, she thought. Always the city below. Always the surveillance. "I built this organization on the principle that I don't extend trust," he said. The East River was dark and wide outside, the bridges lit like statements. Not to my lieutenants past a certain level, not to anyone I couldn't verify 3 ways. He turned. "I trusted you. I didn't know I was doing it. But I gave you my schedule, my communications, my access, and somewhere in 3 years it became trust." He paused. "You're the only person in my organization who's ever protected me without being compensated specifically to do so." "I was compensated," Vesper said. "The benefits package was excellent." Something in his face unlocked. Not quite a smile. Something more real than that. Something that had weight to it. He crossed the room and reached out, tucking a loose strand of dark hair back from her face with a gentleness that seemed to cost him something, and that she suspected he didn't dispense freely. "What do you want?" he said. "After tonight, what do you actually want?" She thought of the Carnegie Hall stage. The 11 seconds. The 3 years of careful disappearing. The grey blazers and the bun and the deliberate, exhausting work of making herself invisible in rooms she deserved to fill. "I want to stop disappearing," she said. His hand curved against her jaw, warm and certain. "Then stop," he said. "I'm not looking away again." By dawn, Gaines had everything they needed. Ridley Halsey left the Greenpoint building with 48 hours and the contents of his pockets. Whether he used them wisely was his own question to answer. The Renne operation began unraveling the following week. Quietly, methodically. The way things come apart when someone with Rhett Calderon's resources and patience decides the time is right. Federal inquiries reopened. Dock supervisors developed unexpected enthusiasms for transparency. Calder Renne's legal team was among the best in the city. It wasn't enough. Vesper was present for all of it. Not standing in the corridor with a tablet, not filtering and organizing from a careful distance. But in the room, at the table, doing what she'd been doing for 3 years, without either of them naming it, holding the architecture of something enormous in her hands and keeping it intact. She kept her hair down. 3 weeks after the gala, Rhett found her in the music room of his Central Park West penthouse on a Tuesday evening, playing the Ravel again. Not for an audience, not to prove anything, but because the music had always been hers and she was tired of letting fear be the reason she couldn't have it. He stood in the doorway until she finished, and when she lifted her hands from the keys, he was still there. "Why did you stop?" he asked the first time. "I forgot who I was playing for," she said. "I thought it was for Carnegie Hall, for the career, for the people in the seats." She looked at the keys. "It was always just for me. I couldn't hear that over everything else." He came and sat beside her on the bench, which she hadn't expected, because Rhett Calderon was not a man who voluntarily occupied a secondary position in anything. He looked at the keyboard for a moment. "Play something else," he said. She played Chopin. She played until the city outside went fully dark and the room was filled with music. And for the first time in 3 years, the sound of it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a door she'd thought was locked, opening easily once she finally reached for the handle. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was precisely where she was supposed to be, and this time she intended to stay. What did you think of the moment Ridley's mask finally fell? Sometimes the deepest betrayal comes wrapped in the voice of someone who was supposed to love you first. If the slow burn tension between Vesper and Rhett had you holding your breath, hit that like button. Share this story with a friend who needs a dark romance in their life tonight. And subscribe to Dark King Stories for more. Drop a comment below. Would you have been as measured as Vesper, or would you have let Rhett make a different call?